CHAPTER XLIII of History of the World War, by Francis March and Richard Beamish. CHAPTER XLIII. England and France strike in the North. Up to July 18, 1918, the Allied armies in France had been steadily on the defensive, but on that date the tide turned. General Foch, who had been yielding territory for several months in the great German drives, now assumed the offensive himself and began the series of great drives which was to crush the German power and drive the enemy in defeat headlong from France. The first of these great blows was the one which began with the appearance of the Americans at Chateau Thierry. The Germans had formed a huge salient whose eastern extremity lay near Rheims, and its western extremity west of Soissons. It was like a great pocket reaching down in the direction of Paris from these two points. Against this salient the French and Americans had directed a tremendous thrust. The Germans resisted with desperation. It was the turning point of the war, but they were compelled to yield. Town after town was regained by the French and American troops, until, by August 5th, the Crown Prince had been driven from the Marne to the Vesle and the salient obliterated. On August 7th, General Foch delivered his second blow. During the fighting on the Marne it had often been wondered by those who were observing the great French general strategy why the British seemed to make no move. Occasionally there had been reports of minor assaults, either on the Lys salient, far north, or on the Somme or Montdidier sections lying between. It had not been noticed that in these minor assaults the English had been obtaining positions of strategic importance, and that they were steadily getting ready for an English offensive. But their time had now come, and on August 7th the armies of Sir Douglas Haig began an attack against the armies of Prince Rupprecht on the Lys salient. This was followed, on August 8th, by another still greater Allied advance in Picardy between Albert and Montdidier. Both of these attacks met with notable success. On the Lys salient the English penetrated a distance of 1,000 yards over a 4-mile front, and followed up this advance by persistent attacks which led to the reoccupation, on August 19th, of Merville, and on August 31st of Mount Kemmel. On this front the Germans had weakened their strength by withdrawing troops to aid other parts of their front, and the British were constantly taking advantage of this weakening. The Germans had found this salient a failure. It had failed to obtain its objective, the flanking of the Lens line south. They therefore were steadily retreating without any intention other than to extricate themselves from positions of no value in the most economical manner. The quick operations of the British, however, led to the capture of many prisoners and guns. The English offensive in Picardy was a more serious matter, and from some points of view was the greatest offensive in the war. The Allied front had been prepared for offensive operations by minor attacks which had secured for the Allied troops dominating positions. The attack was a surprise attack. The Germans were expecting local attacks but not a movement of this magnitude. The surprise was increased because it was made through a heavy mist which prevented observation. It was preceded by tremendous artillery fire which lasted for 4 minutes and which was followed by the charge of infantry and tanks. The German artillery hardly replied at all, and only the resistance of a few rifles and machine guns fired vaguely through the fog met the charging troops. The attack was on a 25-mile front, and on the first day gained 7 miles, captured 7,000 men and 100 guns. On the following day there was an advance of about 5 miles and 17,000 more prisoners were captured. The Germans were now retiring in great haste, blowing up ammunition dumps and abandoning an enormous quantity of stores of all kinds. The English were using cavalry and airplanes, which were flying low over the field and throwing the German troops into confusion. Over 300 guns, including many of heavy caliber, were captured. The ground had been plowed up by shells and thousands of bodies of men and horses were found lying where they fell. A feature of the attack was the swift Whippet tanks which advanced far ahead of the infantry lines. In the French official report occurred the following statement: The brilliant operation which we, in concert with British troops, executed yesterday has been a surprise for the enemy. As occurred in the offensive of July 18th, the soldiers of General Debeney have captured enemy soldiers engaged in the peaceful pursuit of harvesting the fields behind the German lines. By August 10th the Germans had fallen back to a line running through Chaulnes and Roye. Montdidier had been captured and 11 German divisions had been smashed. By August 12th the number of prisoners was 40,000, and by the 18th the Allied front was almost in the same line as it had been in the summer of 1916 before the battle of the Somme. The next step was to recapture Bapaume and Peronne. The French on August 19th captured the Leccy Massif and continued to press on their attack. Noyon fell on the 29th, Roye on the 27th, Chaulnes on the 29th. Further north the British had captured Albert and on the 29th occupied Bapaume. On September 1st they took Peronne with 2,000 prisoners. The advance still continued, and the German weakness was becoming more and more apparent. On September 6th the whole Allied line swept forward, with an average penetration of 8 miles. Chaulnes was captured and the fortress of Ham. On September 17th the British were close to St. Quentin and the French in their old intrenchments before La Fere. On September 18th a surprise advance over a 22-mile front crossed the Hindenburg line at 2 points north of St. Quentin, Villeret, and from Pontreux to Hollom. The First and Third British armies, a little further to the north, were moving toward Cambrai and Douai, threatening not only them, but to get in the rear of Lens. This force proceeded up the Albert Bapaume highway and on August 27th captured a considerable portion of the Hindenburg line. On the 30th they reached Bellecourt, and on September 2nd crossed the Drocourt-Queant line on a 6-mile front. This was the famous switch line, meant to supplement the Hindenburg line, and its capture meant the complete overthrow of the German entrenched positions at this point. The Germans retreated hastily to the Canal du Nord, and on October 3d Queant was captured by an advance on a 20-mile front, along with 10,000 prisoners. The Allied forces were moving steadily forward. On September 18th the British reached the defenses of Cambrai and were encircling the city of St. Quentin. On October 3d the advance upon Cambrai forced the Germans to evacuate the Lens coal fields, and on October 9th another advance over a 30-mile front enabled the Allies to occupy Cambrai and St. Quentin. On the 11th they had reached the suburbs of Douai. By this time the whole of the Picardy salient had been wiped out. The preceding summary of this great movement gives little idea of the tremendous struggle which had gone on during these 2 critical months, and hardly does more than suggest the tremendous importance of the British operations. The Hindenburg line was like a great fortification, and for more than a year had been regarded as impregnable. At Bullecourt there were 2 main lines. 125 yards in front of the first line was a belt of wire 25 feet broad, so thick that it could not be seen through. The line itself contained double machine gun emplacements of ferro concrete, 125 yards apart, with lesser emplacements between them. More belts of wire protected the support line. Here a continuous tunnel had been constructed at a depth of over 40 feet. Every 35 yards there were exits with flights of 45 steps. The tunnels were roofed and lined and bottomed with heavy timber, and numerous rooms branched off. They were lighted by electricity. Large 9-inch trench mortars stood at the trebasses, and strong machine gun positions covered the line from behind. The Hindenburg line was really only one of a series of 20 lines, each connected with the others by communicating trenches. The main lines were solid concrete, separated by an unending vista of wire entanglements. At points this barrier barbed wire extended in solemn formation for 10 miles. This tremendous system of defenses was originally called by the Germans the Siegfried Line, and in the spring of 1917 they found it wise, at points where a strong offensive was expected, to fall back to it for protection. It had been their hope that it would prove an impassable barrier to the Allied troops, but now it had been broken, and the moral effect of the British success was even greater than the material. One of the most notable results of the British advance had been the capture of Lens. It had been captured without a fight, because of the British threat upon its rear, but its capture was of tremendous importance. Lens had been the scene of bitter fighting in the latter part of August, 1917, when the Canadians had specially distinguished themselves. The city had been heavily fortified by the Germans, who had recognized its importance as being the center of the great Lens coal fields, and they had never given it up. It had sometimes been described as the strongest single position that had ever confronted the Allies on the western front. It had been made a sort of citadel of reinforced concrete. Even the courage and power of the Canadians had only given them possession of some of its suburbs. Between these suburbs and the concrete citadel were the coal pits, with their fathomless depths of ages, and the mysteries of cultural strategy. The struggle became a succession of avalanches of gas, burning oil, rifle and machine gun fire. Both sides lost terrifically, but the Germans had held the town. Now it was given up without a blow, and its great coal fields were once more in possession of the French. Before retreating the Germans showed their usual destructive energy, and the mines were found flooded as a result of consistent and scientific use of dynamite. The recapture of Lens was cheering news in Paris. Not the least of the many sufferings of the French during the last 2 years of the war was that which came from the scarcity of coal. Indeed, more than once during these 2 winters coal could not be obtained at any price. These periods unfortunately came in the latter part of the winter, and it happened that they were unusual periods of intense cold. Thousands of people stayed in bed all day in order to keep warm. The capture of Lens, therefore, had been anxiously desired. Nearly the whole of the French coal supply had come from Lens and the adjacent Bethune coal fields. The Bethune field, although steadily working, had never produced enough coal for even the pressing necessities of the French munitions works. The news that Bapaume had fallen on August 29th brought back, especially to the British, memories not only of the previous year and of the great forward movement which, on March 17th, had swept them over Bapaume and Peronne, but also bitter memories of the retreat in the previous March, which had carried them back under the overwhelming German pressure. The capture, therefore, was balm to their spirits, and an English correspondent, Mr. Philip Gibbs, who had accompanied the British on their previous advance, found officers and men full of laughter and full of memories. On all sides were the battlefields of 1916 and 1917. Mametz Wood, Belleville Wood, Usna Hill, Ginchy, Morval, Guillemont. The fields were covered with battle debris, and yet to the English it was sacred ground from the graves of the men who fell there. Those graves still remained. The British shell fire had not touched them, but as the English advanced there were many bodies of gray clad men on the roads and fields, and dead horses, and a litter of barbed wire, and deep shelters dug under banks, and shell craters, and helmets, gas masks, and rifles thrown here and there by the enemy as they fled. Now it was the Germans that were fleeing, and fleeing hopelessly, sullen, bitter at their officers, impatient of discipline. One of the great differences between the attacks of the Allies in their last year of the war and those of preceding years was the increased use and the improved character of the tanks. The tanks were a development of the war. Before the war, however, the development of the Caterpillar tractor had suggested to a few far-sighted people the possibility of evolving from this invention a machine capable of offensive use over rough country in close warfare. Experiments were made in behalf of the English War Office for some time without practical results. At last, after these experiments had resulted in various failures, a type of tractor was finally designed which produced satisfactory results. It was a Caterpillar tractor, with an endless self-laid track, over which internal driving wheels could be propelled by the engines. It was not until July 1916 that the first consignment of these new engines of warfare arrived at the secret maneuver ground. There were 2 kinds. One, called the male, was armored with 2 Hotchkiss quick-fire guns, as well as with an armament of machine guns. The other type, called the female, was armed only with machine guns. The male tank was designed for dealing with the concrete emplacements for the German machine guns. The other was more suitable for dealing with machine gun personnel and riflemen. Some time was taken in training men to use these tanks. For the crew of a tank must suffer a great deal of hardship. On account of the noise of the engine, every command had to be made by signs, and the motion of the tank being like that of a ship on a heavy sea was likely to produce seasickness. The tanks were painted with weird colors for the purpose of concealment, and when they first appeared caused a great deal of wonder and amusement. They were first used in battle on September 15, 1916, in a continuation of the Battle of the Somme, and proved a great surprise to the Germans. The Germans directed all available rifle and machine gun fire upon them without success. A correspondent narrates that as the Creme de Menthe moved on its way, the bullets fell from its sides harmlessly. It advanced upon a broken wall, leaned up against it heavily until it fell with a crash of bricks, and then rose on to the bricks and passed over them and walked straight into the midst of the factory ruins. They were an immense success and had come to stay. End of chapter 43.